Hello and welcome to the Biddeford Parsonage Museum and our new program, Storytime with Lucy Maud Montgomery. As we begin this series of readings of the early writings of LM Montgomery, two books that have provided much insight into these early years are The Alpine Path, the story of my career that was written by LM Montgomery and published by Every Woman's World in 1917, and The Years Before Anne, the early career of Lucy Maud Montgomery, author of Anne of Green Gables, that was written by Frances W.P. Bolger, who was teacher of history at the University of Prince Edward Island. This second resource was first published in 1974 on the occasion of the centenary of the Montgomery's birth and was dedicated to all those who share Lucy Maud Montgomery's affection for Prince Edward Island. Maud Montgomery's objective since her early youth had been to see her name in print. In The Alpine Path, she wrote that when people asked her when she first began to write, she would answer, "I wish I could remember." She was always passionately fond of reading and read the classics that were in her grandparent McNeil's home. They had a strict code on novels, so that Maud's early reading consisted of poems written by Longfellow, Tennyson, Whittier, Byron, Milton, and Burns. The musical rhythms were woven into her very soul from a very early age. She wrote her first poem when she was only 9 years old, which she entitled Autumn. It was written in blank verse. Her father, who was home from Prince Albert at the time for a visit, did not share her elation as she proudly read the poem to him, and he remarked rather unenthusiastically that it didn't sound much like poetry. When she explained to him that it was written in blank verse, his response to her explanation was, "Very blank indeed." She felt squelched at first, but that did not last long, and she was soon writing yards of verse about flowers and months and trees and sunsets. In a letter to her pen pal Ephraim Weber later in life, she wrote that she used a very mechanical and cold-blooded way to get the words to rhyme, and noted that Tennyson also had used a rhyming dictionary in his writings. When Maud was 12 years of age, she wrote a long poem which she called Evening Dreams, of which the first two stanzas read, "When the evening sun is setting quietly in the west, in a halo of rainbow glory, I sit me down to rest. I forget the present and the future. I live over the past once more, as I see before me crowding the beautiful days of yore." Her school teacher had convinced her that she had composed a masterpiece. She wrote a copy of it and sent it to the editor of an American magazine called The Household. Several weeks later, the poem was returned to her with an icy rejection slip. She then sent it to the editor of the Charlottetown Examiner, but again it was rejected. Although these rejections crushed her at the time, she continued to write poems because she couldn't help it. She wrote that she had learned the first, last, and middle lesson: never give up. We are so fortunate that she did not give up, for she has written and had published more than 800 poems, more than 500 short stories, 21 novels, as well as 5 volumes of personal journals covering the years from 1889 until her death in 1942. In the winter of 1888, Maud entered a writing competition for the Montreal Witness and Canadian Homestead. She had submitted a story that had been told to her by Grandfather McNeil about Captain LaForce, and she had received honorable mention for it. I'm going to read from The Years Before Anne. The story of Cape LaForce is a bit of tragic unwritten history, harking back to the days when the island of St. John belonged to France. France and England were at war. French privateers infested the Gulf, sallying therefrom to plunder the commerce of the New England colonies. One of these was commanded by a captain named LaForce. One night they anchored off the Cavendish shore, at that time an unnamed wooded solitude. For some reason, the crew came ashore and camped for the night on the headland known as Cape Leforce. The captain and his mate shared a tent and endeavored to come to a division of their booty. They quarreled, and it was arranged that they should fight a duel at sunrise. But in the morning, as the ground was being paced off, the mate suddenly raised his pistol and shot Captain Leforce dead. I do not know if the mate was punished for this deed. Probably not. It was a mere brief sentence in a long page of bloodshed. But the captain was buried by his crew on the spot where he fell, and I have often heard grandfather say that his father had seen the grave in his boyhood. It has long ago crumbled off into the waves, but the name still clings to the red headland. On September the 21st, 1889, at the age of 14, Maud would turn 15 on November 30th, we read her first entry in the complete journals of LM Montgomery, the PEI years. She wrote that she had kept a diary since the age of 9, but she had burned it that day as it was silly and very dull. Now, 6 years later, she wrote, "I'm going to begin a new kind of diary. Life is beginning to get interesting for me." That winter in February, 2 of her classmates at school were also writing essays for the Montreal Witness School competition. This year, she decided that she would write a story about the sinking of the famous Marco Polo in 1883 that Maud had witnessed when she was only 8 years old. The Marco Polo was the fastest sailing boat of her class ever built, and the story of her wreck was the talk of Cavendish for many years. In her journal on May 31st, 1890, Maud wrote, "The Montreal Witness came today, and in it was the essay report for P.E. Island. As I expected, Nate's rated higher than mine, but I came next and was third for the county." The winter that Maud was 15 years old, she was feeling the loneliness of not being able to invite her friends into their home, and her grandparents were averse to her going anywhere with her friends. Her father was living in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and had remarried. Maud now had a 2.5-year-old half-sister, Kate, whom she had never seen, and she had never met her stepmother. On April 22nd, Maud wrote, "Do you know Journal Mine? I may take a trip out west to see Father this summer. Grandpa Montgomery is talking of going, and if he does, he will take me. It has been talked of vaguely all winter, but it is about settled now. I expect we will go in August. I feel so excited about it. It will be such a splendid trip. And then to see darling Father again. I am frightened to think or say much about it, for fear I will not get after all." But on Saturday, August the 9th, 1890, her Uncle Charles Crosby, who was married to her Aunt Jane Montgomery, came to Cavendish to bring her to Grandfather Montgomery's in Park Corner. It was a hot and dusty drive, made even longer by her uncle stopping in to visit an acquaintance in Clifton along the way. She spent 2 nights in Park Corner before she and Grandfather Montgomery drove into Kensington on Monday morning, where they met Sir John A. Macdonald and his wife, who were touring the island on a special train. Maud and Grandfather were invited to join them on their train, and they traveled together to Summerside, where there was a reception for Sir John in the market hall that evening. It was Maud's first time to ride on a train, and she enjoyed it very much. They stayed the night in Summerside at Aunt Nancy Campbell's, and on the morning of the 12th, Uncle Dan drove them down to the wharf, where they boarded the boat, the St. Lawrence, which would take them to Pointe de Chêne in New Brunswick. From there they traveled to St. John and boarded the CPR train bound for Montreal. Maud was in the upper berth, and she wrote, "The upper berths are not at all nice. They are so small you don't dare to move in them, and if you forget once in a while and sit up, whack goes your head against the roof. When morning dawned, we were among the wooded hills of Maine. I got up, or rather I got down, and I've had a splendid time so far. I love traveling." 7 days later, on Monday, August 18th, they arrived in Regina at 5 a.m. It was cold and dim and foggy. They went to the Windsor Hotel and got rooms. Her grandfather went out to see if there was a letter from Maud's father. In a short time, a knock came at the door. She opened it to see her grandfather smiling broadly, and with him Maud's father. She laughed and cried. It was so delightful to see dear father again. It had been 5 years since she had last seen him, and what a day they had together. Since there was no passenger train from Regina to Prince Albert, they would have to travel on a caboose. She thought that it sounded bad, and she found it was as bad as she had feared. They arrived at Duck Lake at 11 at night, then had to drive 1.5 miles in a buckboard to spend the night at a Mr. Cameron's house. Her father had telegraphed his father-in-law to meet them with a team, and they had another full day of travel, finally arriving at her father's house at 4 p.m., 3,000 miles from her Prince Edward Island home. She wrote that her stepmother seemed quite nice and friendly, and her 2-year-old half-sister was a very pretty child. 2 days later, Maud wrote in her journal that she was desperately homesick. She wrote, "I'm afraid I'm not going to like his wife. I came here prepared to love her warmly and look upon her as a real mother, but I fear it will prove impossible." And things did not get any better between them as time went on. On Monday, September 1st, Maud started at the high school where there were a total of 9 pupils, 3 girls and 6 boys. She wrote in her diary, "I am going to study for a teacher's certificate." On Sunday, December 7th, she wrote in her journal, "Well, this has really been the proudest day of my life. I feel at least 3 inches taller than I did yesterday. About 3 weeks ago, I wrote a poem on the legend of Cape Leforce and sent it down home to the Charlottetown Patriot. I did not dare hope it would be printed, so I never squeaked a word about it to anyone. Today, when I came down, ready for Sunday school, Father came in with last night's mail, and among it a Patriot. I seized it with a beating heart and trembling fingers and opened it. I grew dizzy. The letters danced before my eyes, and I felt a curious sensation of choking, for there in one of the columns was my poem. I was just too delighted to speak. Father was so pleased, and I am so glad and elated and happy. I can't find words to express my feelings." Also in the Alpine Path, Maud wrote, "One afternoon, Father came in with a copy of the Patriot. My verses were in it. It was the first sweet bubble on the cup of success, and of course it intoxicated me." I shall now read her 39-stanza poem on Cape Leforce, a legend of the early days of Prince Edward Island. One evening when the sun was low, I stood upon the wave-kissed strand and watched the white-sailed boats glide by, their sails by evening breezes fanned. In dimpling azure lay the sea, the rippling wavelets tinged with gold, while to the rosy clouded west a sparkling path of glory rolled. I climbed the rocky cliffs and gained a rugged cape, around whose sides the wavelets crept with moaning sigh, or surges dashed their mighty tides. Behind the lovely village lay the fertile fields of waving green, fair sloping hills and quiet dales, with spruce and maple groves between. Before me slept that peerless sea, its beauty tranquil and serene. Search all our lovely island o'er, thou wilt not find a fairer scene. I stood upon that lovely cliff and called to mind the legend dread, which made it an accursed spot, one shunned by superstitious tread. 'Twas years ago, ere yet the flag of Britain claimed our loyalty, and fair Prince Edward Island owed allegiance to the fleur-de-lis. When war's dark cloud hung threatening low above our fair Canadian land, and echoes of the troubled strife reached e'en our island's quiet strand. And o'er our blue St. Lawrence Gulf sailed many a plundering privateer, defying law and right and force in their tyrannical career. Ooh.
Jeez.
I should probably do that one over again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And o'er our blue St. Lawrence Gulf sailed many a plundering privateer, defying law and right and force in their piratical career. But when the strife of war had passed and gentle peace resumed her reign, they met the fate they well deserved, captured or wrecked upon the main. And one, a treasure-laden ship, was stranded here one autumn day, and off this headland, lone and bleak, with all her precious freight she lay. And loath to lose his ill-won wealth, the captain planned how he might save the treasure that his vessel held from English foes or ocean wave. The shore, he said, is bleak and wild, the rocks no human footsteps bear, and death will seal the lips of those who know I hide the treasure there. So all that sunny autumn day the captain and his pirate band bore untold wealth from ship to shore and hid it on the rocky strand. But when the western sky had peeled and darkness veiled the forests wide, they tented on the lonely cape to wait the dawn of morning tide. Then rose the bursts of laughter wild, mingled with curses deep and strong, the taunting sneer, the fierce reply, the vulgar joke and drunken song. Wild was the scene, but when the moon rose slowly up the eastern blue, tipping the dark fir trees with light, unconscious lay the drunken crew. And all were wrapped in heavy sleep, save two, the captain and the mate, who sat together in a tent, their faces drawn with rage and hate. And as they sat, above them poised the friends of hatred and despair, of malice, envy, murder, scorn, revenge, and avarice, all were there. There to divide their ill-won gains and plan the murder of the crew, had met those different types of crime and quarreled, as all such will do. Facing each other, there they sat, the captain, tall and dark and stern, with sneering lip and glittering eye, where all dark passions seemed to burn. The mate, with vicious, brutal face, growled like some snarling beast at bay, defiant threats and savage oaths of vengeance on the coming day. Well, be it so, the captain cried. Tomorrow, when the sun shall rise, our pistols will decide our claims, and one shall lose or win the prize. Good night, my friend, and pleasant dreams. I leave you now till dawn of day. He bowed with air of mocking scorn and sought the moonlight's silver ray. The night was calm, all sounds were hushed, save for some lonely night bird's cry, or wavelets splashing on the shore, or cool night breezes rustling by. All night upon the sullen verge, with restless tread the captain walked, while o'er the sea the moonbeams played, and shadows cast past the headland stalked. Did some presentiment of ill upon the morrow cross his brain? Felt he repentance for the past, or schemed he but fresh crimes again? At length, when morning flushed the east, the rivals met. The half-drunk crew stood huddled in a powerless group, not knowing what to say or do. A look of craven fear was stamped upon the mate's low, brutal face, mingled with sinister cunning, as before the tent he took his place. The captain, calm, composed, and firm, betrayed no trace of doubt or fear. His face still wore its cool contempt, his lips their cold, sardonic sneer. 12 paces off I'll stand, he said, and with his pistol in his hand, he lightly turned upon his heel and calmly walked toward his stand. Sudden, the mate his pistol raised. What need is there to tell the rest to tell? A sharp report, and in his blood, shot through the heart, the captain fell. Then ere the fear-struck crew could stir, flinging his weapon from his hand, the guilty wretch sprang down the cliff and fled along the rocky strand. No hand was raised to stay his flight. Few knew the crime, none cared who did. And ere the sun had left the wave, the murderer was in safety hid. And ne'er was he to justice brought, for in those days of blood and strife, murder was deemed a slight offense, and lightly held was one man's life. And on this lonely wind-swept cape, right where the murdered captain fell, a hasty grave the sailors made, and winds and surges rang his knell. Forgotten in his lonely grave, he slept while years unnumbered fled, and dark traditions of the spot enwrapped it with unfading dread. Long since all vestige of the grave has vanished, but the legend lives, and to this headland's rocky steeps a weird and awful interest gives. And to this day, this lonely cape, which stems the billow's stormy course, still bears the name of him who fell upon its summit, Cape LaForce. Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote this in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories. We hope that you will join us again tomorrow when we do another story, the story of the Marco Polo. I hope to see you then. Bye for now.